Negotiations between Ukraine and Russia have failed to deliver any significant progress toward ending Moscow's 12-day war. Even before the talks began, Ukraine had rejected a Russian proposal to create humanitarian corridors for civilians to escape. Now, most of the corridors would have led to Russia or to its ally, Belarus, a plan Ukraine had called immoral. A Ukrainian delegation today flew to Belarus for that third round of negotiations with Russia, which have now concluded. Ukraine said there have been small positive steps, but no significant improvements. Russia also cautioned against hope for a major outcome. And meanwhile, Russian forces are continuing to attack cities across Ukraine's south and east. And a Ukraine army chief has warned that Russian troops are preparing to storm the capital.
The Ukrainian national anthem echoes across Kyiv. But just a few miles from the capital, people continue to seek safety from the ongoing Russian assault. Meanwhile, the mayor of Kramatorsk said 2 people were killed and 6 wounded in missile strikes in the eastern Ukrainian city. On Monday, Russia's defense ministry released this footage, purporting to show tanks advancing towards Kyiv. But Ukrainians are determined it won't be taken without a fight. Volunteers are helping protect their capital, but there are no guarantees it will be enough. As diplomatic efforts continue, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remained defiant in his message to the world. We will not forgive the shooting of unarmed people, the destruction of our infrastructure. We won't forgive the creation of hundreds and hundreds of victims, the suffering of thousands and thousands of people. And God won't forgive. Not today, not tomorrow, never. A spokesperson for Russia's defense ministry has announced a number of humanitarian corridors. Those fleeing Kyiv have been offered passage to neighboring Belarus, while those in Kharkiv an escape to Russia itself.
This is an unacceptable option for opening humanitarian corridors. Our people will not go from Ivankov, from Dymyr, from Vyshgorod, from near Kyiv to Belarus, in order to then fly to Russia.
In Kherson, the only major city captured by the Russians, people have displayed their defiant objection. Standing their ground, even as the occupiers fire guns above their heads.
And joining me now is Maria Sarichenko from Mariupol. That's one of the cities that's been under siege for more than a week now. And she's left her home to escape to the western city of Lviv, and she joins me from there. A very warm welcome, Maria. Thank you so much for taking the time under these terrible circumstances. Over the past few days, you've been speaking to my colleagues, and you've told us that your grandmother is still in Mariupol. Have you had a chance to hear from her and find out how she's doing?
Thanks for having me. Unfortunately, I haven't heard from my grandmother for a week already, and today is still nothing. So, yeah, what I left is hope and pray that she's alive and she's healthy.
And have you been able to hear from anyone else who is still in the city?
Not much, really, because today, I think in the morning, the last cell tower was destroyed. But yesterday morning, we were able to hear some, SMS from a few of people. And they shared that the situation is still really terrible. They still have nothing in terms of food. They don't have any heat. They don't have any connection. And what is the scariest thing for me is that the city is out of water. So people tried to drink rainwater, or even some of my close people, they tried to go to sea to gather some seawater, but it's salty, obviously.
So no water, no food, no heat in this cold. Denied of these basic services, in addition to what you've described, trying to find water, how are people there trying to survive?
Well, I think what helps them is the sense of unity and sense of determination, because people believe that it will end soon, and they try to help each other as they can, but they have fear just to go out of their homes because the city is being constantly bombed by Russians. That's why there is no chance for them to escape, and so-called humanitarian corridor attempts, they failed both times.
I do want to ask you about those humanitarian corridors, especially from Mariupol. Were they at any point seen, what was Russia's offer at any point seen as a realistic option for people to escape?
Not today really, but yesterday and a few days ago, there were few attempts, like official attempts, to organize those corridors. And even some people who had at least some connection, they tried to organize in the center of the city to get on bus and escape from the city of Mariupol. But once they tried to actually go out of the city, Russians continued shooting and shelling, and nothing happened in terms of success. And today, Russians offered these corridors, but to the occupied territories, which is absolutely unacceptable. And people just don't have any hope that Russians will really help them. So they choose to stay and just hope that Ukrainian people will help them go out of the city.
If the Ukrainian government is able to find an agreement that is able to create a humanitarian corridor, I mean, will people trust themselves to leave their homes and wherever they may be taking shelter to try and actually leave Ukraine, given the Russian shelling that happened the last time they made the attempt?
Absolutely, because people want to save their life. And of course, half of the city of Mariupol is right now almost destroyed, because every minute they hear bombs and attacks. But if they have a chance from Ukrainian government to save their life and leave the city and escape this war zone, I'm sure that many of them will be able to do that. I'm not sure about my grandma because she is 80 years old, and I'm not sure she will really be able to survive during this whole trip, out of Ukraine, because she needs to take medicines, she needs to take some food and water every day, and I just want to have some connection with her.
Maria, I'm so sorry to hear about your grandma. We are happy that you've managed to make it to Lviv, because Western Ukraine appears to be safer compared to the rest of the country. Can you tell us a little bit about what the situation is like there?
Well, in Lviv, there are a lot of people coming from eastern parts of Ukraine, like Kiev or Kharkiv, and people volunteering everywhere here. We have maybe thousands of volunteers who want to help the army, who try to buy medicines, who try to organize some shelters, because a lot of people need some shelter because of the huge traffic coming from the capital of Ukraine. And people really believe that we will win, and I'm 100% sure that it will happen soon. So I think this sense of unity helps people to stay strong, even in such a horrible situation.
Right, Maria, we're going to leave it there. Thank you again for joining us and giving us a glimpse of this terrible situation. Please take care.
Thank you.
So for more, let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who is reporting for us from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. And Nick, good to see you there. These previous two rounds of talks have clearly failed to end the bloodshed. What are we hearing has come out of round three?
Well, all that we've been hearing from the negotiating team, the Ukrainian negotiating team, is pretty modest stuff. It's about technicalities, about making a humanitarian corridor work, but we've seen those fail in the last few days. I think it's basically about the optics right now. Neither side can afford to not be at those talks, to stand accused of not being interested in peace. But actually, if you look at their negotiating positions, the Russians, they've slightly toned down their rhetoric. They went into this war with very bombastic rhetoric about demanding denazification of Ukraine, whatever that means, and basically Ukraine to kind of fully capitulate. Now they just want Ukraine to recognize Russian ownership of Crimea. They want Kiev to recognize those self-proclaimed republics in the east, and they want Kiev to also basically put it in its constitution that it will stay neutral. Those are basically the full maximalistic demands they started off with. The Ukrainians obviously cheered and buoyed by pretty extensive successes on the battlefield. It's obviously a different situation in the air where Russia still has that superiority, but on the battlefield, Ukraine is doing an extraordinary amount of damage to those Russian troops, lots of prisoners of war being taken. So there isn't a sense on either side that it is time to cut losses for now. Both sides still sticking to their maximum demands, Ukraine wanting those Russian troops out without any kind of concession in return. So I think for now it's about the optics, about keeping talking, but I don't think anyone has any real expectations that something's going to come out of these talks.
Now, tell me more about those humanitarian corridors that you mentioned. I mean, people are desperate to get out, but previous efforts have failed. Is there any hope that that might change now?
Again, I hate to be the bringer of bad news, but I think there's very little chance, especially you have to think now, this is a time where hundreds of soldiers are being killed every day on both sides. And the idea that these two sides are going to bilaterally, just the two of them without outside mediation, have even the basic trust to make this kind of thing work, I think is unfortunately a little optimistic. We've seen even this more modest attempts to organize humanitarian corridors for Mariupol, a city of several 100,000 people that are now trapped in eastern Ukraine with Russian troops all around in the sea on the other side. That has twice failed. So the idea that some more ambitious scheme for a wider humanitarian corridor across Ukraine could work, I think for now is a little early. This is a situation that is getting worse. People in some cities now have been without power, without water, without mobile phone coverage for days. People are having to start eating their supplies, their tins, their kind of emergency supplies that they put down going into this crisis. So there is definitely a situation that is getting worse by the day, and the impact on ordinary civilians is going to get worse as this drags on.
Now, in Kyiv, where you are, there has, of course, also been an immense Russian military convoy building up outside of the capital. What is the sense in Kyiv of what's to come?
I think in the early days of this war, there was a hope that somehow Ukraine could reach ordinary Russians. We saw lots of Ukrainian pop stars, YouTubers, people who have a following in Russia trying to directly address people in Russia, get those people out on the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities, to protest, to try and put pressure on the Russian government to draw back, to end this war. I think lots of Ukrainians now are increasingly disillusioned and less willing to believe that the Russian broader population, even if they're against this war, are willing to risk anything and actually come out against this. I think in Ukraine now also there's increasing disillusionment with the West. Yes, the West is giving weapons, but not as many and of the kind that Ukraine wants. NATO has refused to close the skies, to create a no-fly zone over the country, which would allow Ukraine to push its advantage on the ground through and to really make inroads into that Russian advance. So I think there is an increasing kind of understanding here in Ukraine that basically Ukraine can only rely on itself, its own army. And people are increasingly believing that they might even have a chance against Russia, given how many difficulties the Russians are having with logistics, how many problems they're having with their own hardware, lots of which is in a lot worse condition than was expected. So it's basically a question of sitting this out and trying to keep on going until somehow, miraculously, maybe Ukraine is able to push these Russian troops out, or the Russians decide to call it quits. But I think the hope that somehow Russian civil society would weigh in and prevent the Kremlin from doing this, I think that is unfortunately a hope that is growing increasingly scarce among ordinary Ukrainians.
Right, DW's Nick Connolly reporting for us from Kyiv. Thank you so much, as always. So how are Russians viewing this invasion? Let's find out from DW Russian affairs analyst Constantine Egbert. Constantine, thousands of people have been arrested at protests across Russia. Is there a possibility that Russians could stop Vladimir Putin's invasion?
Oh, frankly, I agree with Nick. I think there is very little possibility of it now, at least now, I would say. Although the number of arrests was huge, even compared to the arrests during the protests called for by the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who's now in jail, about a year ago or something. It's comparable. but it's still not a lot for a country of 140 million plus people. I think that also the repression is tightening. Today, there was partially confirmed footage of people being checked randomly by police on the streets of at least big cities like Moscow. They were asked to produce their mobile phones, and the police scrolled the phones looking for probably messages against the war or what kind of telegram channels people are reading. Those who refused were reportedly taken to the police precincts. Again, that has to be verified, but frankly, I wouldn't be surprised because I think the government wants to really nip it in the bud. Also, I suppose, the Kremlin is probably concerned about the geography of these protests. 18 or 19 cities in Russia count population of 1 million or more. But the geography is much wider. It's, I think, about 50 cities where the arrests were made. That means that there are Russian-style, fairly small places, like places with 300, 400,000 population. In such places, people who protest are much better known. And the protest spreads much quicker. Protests, or at least news of protests, spread much quicker. If you combine it with the impending, I think, redundancies, huge redundancies at factories that close, at businesses that close, eventually what may shake the foundations is not the peace movement as such, but the peace movement combined with workers that are discontent. That may be a much bigger problem for Putin than the big city intelligentsia and students that are mostly those who rally against the war now.
Okay, so it's a dangerous situation for citizens who might be against the war. I also want to ask you about those small places you mentioned in Russia. I mean, are they feeling the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Not yet, but the speed with which basically Western business withdraws from Russia will also mean that a lot of Russian companies will collapse. That is inevitable. Just to give you an example, and it's something that I've only seen probably once in my lifetime. In 1998, when Russia defaulted on its debt, international debt, the currency rates today are actually, well, the dollar and the ruble gained 100% over what they used to be, let's say, 10 days ago. So it's really something that is going to impact Russia, which was built into the global economy very much. So, okay, you have the Adidas or let us say major car makers withdrawing, but they were served by a lot of other companies, which are Russian companies. So these companies are inevitably going to go out of business or slash staff. That means that lots of people will feel what's happening quite soon, but probably not really tomorrow. And the state, the Russian state, will have a big problem dealing with that too, because there's a lot of people discontent momentarily.
Okay, they will be feeling the pinch then. DW's Russian affairs analyst, Constantine Egbert, thanks so much for joining us on the show. How are Russians viewing this invasion? Let's put that to our Russian analyst, Roman Gonzalenko. He joins me now. Is there a possibility that Russians could stop Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine?
Well, a lot of Ukrainians hope for that, but I would be very, very careful. We've seen that Russian propaganda is very effective. It is working, and it has been working for years. So when we look at the state polls in Russia, they show that up to 3/4 of the Russian population actually support Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. Some independent polls make a different picture, but not very much. So we've seen, for example, estimates of the Levada Center in Moscow. They say up to 2/3 of Russians, so 60% plus, support the current Russian actions in Ukraine, support this war. So I would say it is possible that Russians could stop Vladimir Putin, but there are a few Russians who can do that. It's a minority.
And domestically, what effect has this invasion had on Russian society?
Well, this effect is very much underestimated, I would say, especially in certain areas, like, for example, spare parts for cars or Western car manufacturers, or in general, I would say, this tendency when Western companies are leaving Russia. I think this is something that no one really expected when they planned this operation. I think this is something that is hitting Russians very much. And also that the West is excluding Russian from air travel, blocking Russian ships worldwide, sending Russian athletes home, not allowing them to participate in competitions. This is something I think that Russia underestimated, and this influence will grow. It will grow, and the frustration within the Russian society will also grow.
Now, I want to ask you more about the West's response, because the U.S. and Poland, they've been discussing the delivery of fighter jets to Ukraine. Does that signal NATO's direct involvement in this conflict?
Well, it's disputable. Russia has been warning NATO not to do such things, and we've seen today new warnings from the Russian foreign minister. The spokeswoman said that sending troops to Ukraine, Western fighters who would fight on the Ukrainian side, or bringing fighter jets to Ukraine, sending this kind of weapons to Ukraine would lead to a catastrophe, she said. So there is a clear warning on the Russian side from President Putin and from the foreign minister not to do that. But on the other hand, I've spoken to an expert today, a British expert, and he said we have to try this. We have to try this and see what Russian reaction would be, because we've seen deliveries to Ukraine of Western weapons, and it hasn't been. And there was no strong reaction from Russia, I would say. So Russia expected possibly things like that, but the reaction has been relatively moderate.
All right, DW's Russia analyst Roman Gonzalenko, thank you so much for joining us with that update.